Been getting a lot of commentary on when's the new video coming out. It's been interesting lately moving through the transitions of life and just experiencing the variety of what's arising. Lately, there's been a lot of conversation about what's coming up for people in we could say, a collective sense. And what seems really clear is that right around now, everyone is in the midst of their own particular transitions. Seems to be possibly seasonal and also possibly related to the post-holiday blues, as some people will call it. But regardless, we are going to get into something today that may be a very useful tool for you in order to start to engage with thought and start recognizing the very outset of reaction and other aspects of how essentially this system of protection works. We've spoken a lot about how the mind works in forms of creating protections where they aren't needed, surviving feelings where that actually doesn't make any sense. And with this new development, this video is going to talk about a technique that we can just call the wedge technique. We can say that thoughts, reactions, and distractions are essentially narcotics for what we feel. I'll go ahead and repeat that our thoughts, our reactions, and our distractions tend to lead to a feeling that we call comfort. And if we sit with that and we rest with this experience of comfort, what we start to realize is there is something satisfying and predictable about that quality of experience. We are pining for a numbness. We are essentially fighting for a feeling of no feeling. And really, as you begin to engage with this path and you move along the way, you will start to find that is actually not really possible, in that we eventually move ourselves into a very tight identity box where we are avoiding all sensation with a type of vigor and desperation that eventually begins to lock us into a state or an experience that we will usually refer to as suffering. The thing with suffering, especially in this existential sense, that's so remarkable is that really suffering doesn't exist. It's just simply an evaluation and an assumption of a group of sensations or a singular sensation. So, in order to start examining that and to start playing with the edges of this experience, we can start using this wedge technique. It's very Sisyphean. We can start to play with the requirements of our existence. And we can start asking ourselves certain questions, or actually in this case, one particular question in the midst of pretty much any experience throughout our lives, and begin to see where the dominoes begin to fall. And speaking of those dominoes, we're talking about reactions. What we will start to see is that assumptions and reactions begin to automatically come into place, and then they continue reacting to each other, so on and so forth. And we basically have a series of reactions that move down the way. So let's get into it a little bit. We could say that moving throughout our lives, we can start to see maybe certain external reactions show up. But if we really are used to being still and sitting with what we feel, we begin to realize that the internal reaction, what we could call a resistance and hesitation or avoidance, some mechanism of survival, essentially happens almost immediately. And then from there are thoughts that come into play that give us a sense of history, some thoughts that give us a sense of external events that have a cause and effect. And as we begin to kind of trace those back, we start to see that really it comes down to a primary assumption. This seems to be the crux of it all. We could say that on its most basic level, we have a sensation that we have already determined that we don't like, and that we begin to fight that sensation. And so on the most fundamental level, we have an experience, a feeling seems to arise, an instant assumption seems to take place there, and then we tend to basically start tracing these dominoes as they fall, a reaction to a reaction, a resistance to a resistance, an avoidance to an avoidance, or, which actually can be a lot more challenging for people, some sort of hesitation, a paralysis, a moving here and then back and then here and then back, and essentially playing a dance in duality, so to speak. There's this interesting experience there. And if we look at the very initial experience itself, the outset of experience, before a thought even arises, we can start to get a sense of where things start to kind of go downhill. Or we could say stepping into the vortex, going down the rabbit hole, the downward spiral, whatever you would like to say there. And it seems to show up around a preference, around a sensation. But something else also begins to happen. We have an assumed have-to of experience, and this is where this wedge technique will come into play. Simply ask, do I have to? And sometimes grammatically that won't make sense, but here's an example. So let's say something happens, I'm driving down the road, somebody cuts me off, there's a feeling or a sensation, and there's a reaction starting to come up. In the midst of that reaction, in the midst of wanting to demonstrate your middle finger to this person, you can ask yourself, in that very moment, do I have to take this action? Do I have to react? Do I have to feel this way? And what will happen there is we'll essentially create a wedge in the experience. Enough of a delay in the reaction, and enough of a delay in the dominoes falling, that you'll begin to start to see the outset of the experience. And the recommendation here is, once you've created that wedge, to look closely internally and to see what the sensational experience is. Notice what's happening in the body. Notice maybe an elevated state of breathing or a sensation, usually in the gut, the chest, somewhere in here. Doesn't really matter, actually, where it shows up. It seems to kind of take a different tone for everyone. But the point is, you actually have a pretty decent relationship with that experience already, but it might not be a decent awareness of that relationship. And this is where you'll start to see that the relationship itself is one of avoidance or resistance. So in the midst of that experience, insert the wedge with, do I have to? Do I have to take this next step? Do I have to speed up and confront this other driver? And this is just a hypothetical example, of course. Do I have to feel the way I'm feeling? And to make it make more grammatical sense, you can even look at the sensation. For instance, let's just say the mind is already labeling that experience and basically saying, this is discomfort, or this is pain, or this is frustration or anger. Ask yourself, does it have to be? And yeah, there is a little bit of a thought-oriented approach here, but the benefit of this is preventing those dominoes from falling and being able to see the initial experience itself. Does this have to be frustration? Do I have to perceive this as frustration? Does this have to be difficult? Does it have to be perceived as difficult? And the more honest we get in this experience, we'll start to see something that's actually remarkable. We'll start to realize that there isn't a have to here, that the have to is assumed and somehow automatically concluded for us. And once that conclusion or assumption takes place, then the rest of the reactions tend to follow suit. You can just call this the outset of a trigger. And we're not necessarily attempting to avoid triggering, necessarily. What we're attempting to do is see how triggering is functioning. We're observing more closely in this regard. So now you step in and you see what starts to happen in these circumstances. And to remind you, if you're new to this channel, there's a lot of videos that essentially describe some of the concepts and pointings herein. There is no singular identity. It's just a system, an amalgamation of these mechanisms that start to kick into play depending on conditions, environment, and relationships with people, family, friends, social environments, people at work, so on and so forth. So those particular things, once they amalgamate into a condensed viewpoint or condensed space, a construct of a person begins to form there. But there is actually no singular identity. There is just mechanisms that seem to be running on their own. And if we don't challenge them in a playful way, what happens is they begin to essentially run our experience. We move into autopilot, or you could say you move into your slumber. And maybe this is why we call it awakening, because it's like waking up from an automated dream. And so when you begin to see these particular pieces as they arise, it starts to give you a sense of choice. And even if you've had this experience of no doer, if you're in this place now where there feels like there's agency, this is a powerful tool to be able to get you to recognize what's actually occurring here. There is an outset of something strong, a automatic conclusion of that outset, and then what happens from there is essentially dominoes beginning to fall, reactions and triggers, reactions reacting to reactions. And it seems almost like the output of a machine, a mechanism, or you could say a computer. You give it an input, it gives you a specific output, and oftentimes in a chain reaction. Once you recognize there is no have to in the experience, then it almost feels like there's a choice. And at that point, you will begin to realize it doesn't really matter what you do or you don't do. You're starting to recognize something else, that there is a relationship and an experience that is being imposed upon you. And if you recognize that, then suddenly the agency of attention becomes really clear. And it's not that really attention has any agency, yet I would say the most primary human experience when it comes to agency seems to be the flashlight of attention, where attention can look. Attention seems to be able to look into thought. Attention also seems to be able to look into sensation. The epidemic we face as modern human beings is that attention is often moved into thought in spite of sensation, and that right there will give us a sense of untethering or disconnection or disassociation. So a massive aspect of this path toward realization is moving that flashlight of attention from thought and moving it directly back into sensation. So let's play with the wedge again. You can ask, do I have to, essentially in any moment? If there seems to be a specific pattern of existence, ask yourself, do I have to? And then from there, recognize first, before even taking the action or making an assumption or placing any meaning on it, recognize if there is a have to. And we can get rather extreme with this, of course. Do you have to eat? If you sit with that question, you'll realize that the answer is seemingly an untenable one, that really we don't even have to eat. It's probably a good idea, of course, but you don't have to. This is beginning to show you that you are already primarily free, that there are no requirements. You really don't have to do anything. But once that assumption or conclusion begins to arise that there is a have to, that there is a requirement here, that seems to be the outset of any trigger, any form of disassociation, any distraction, and thought itself. So see if you can start applying the wedge everywhere you go and see what space that begins to create. Because then you'll begin to see that it doesn't really matter what you do or you don't do. There's something else that we can get into in another video called relationship. And that relationship remains mysterious yet somehow known. That is part of this emptiness, this great mystery. The space between subject and object is what we could call relationship. And it doesn't seem like it can actually be objectified or definable. And sure, we could attempt to, but by doing so, we created another object. And so in that object-subject relationship, that space between the mystery, the relationship, starts to become rather clear. And we begin to find that there is a free, formless aspect there in that relationship. But if there's a have to, there's no free, formless aspect there. There's an automatic must do. And that right there will begin to show you how these mechanisms of trigger, mechanisms of disassociation, thought, and distraction really function. And being able to see that, inserting this wedge, almost gives us a little bit of a choice. Do I have to interact with the next step of this reaction? Do I have to interact with what seems to be the meaning in this experience? Or Can I stay still? And can I stay in absolute concert with what is being felt? So that's what we're doing here. I would love to hear some more in the comments below. See if this wedge technique is providing any sort of value for you, but it does seem to have provided value for those who are doing sessions. And who knows, maybe in that wedge, you'll start to notice a massive gap. You'll start to notice the stillness. You'll start to notice the pause and the silence. And right there, you will begin to touch into truest nature. And that seems to be a huge aspect of this entire path. Dogen, as mentioned before, says that we must know ourselves in order to forget ourselves. This is to touch into truest nature right here. Do you have any requirements at all? And don't conclude. This needs to be done all the time in a vigilant way immediately in the experience. If you conclude, basically what you're doing is you're stepping away from the experience again. The recommendation here is to engage and immerse entirely as fully as possible, which means no matter what comes up, see if you can insert a wedge there. Do I have to take it this way? Do I have to respond this way? Do I have to have this relationship with the sensation here? Does this have to be difficulty? Does this have to be avoidance, resistance, or hesitation? And you'll begin to see that there's no have to there. And when you realize that, you're getting much closer to direct experience. And that, well, I suppose we can call that presence. So hopefully you'll take this on. If you do, please be really diligent about it. Do it all day. Notice it in every aspect of your existence and with eyes wide open. But also see if you can play with it a little bit in the midst of meditation. And I think what you'll find is there is an energetic curiosity that begins to arise, that we don't necessarily even have to take a verbal approach to this in terms of do I have to. We start to recognize immediately what's happening, and we see that the have to doesn't actually seem to exist. Well, I hope to hear more from you, and thank you all for waiting for this video. I know it's been a while, and we'll be putting a lot more out soon. So talk to you soon.